Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Clean Arctic Alliance's pre-PPR webinar. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping matters. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and will be made available after today. And secondly, if you have any questions, could you please put them in the Q&A option, which should be near to the bottom of your screen. And what we'll try and do is take all the questions during the Q&A session at the end, but you can add them at any point to the Q&A through the Q&A option. We will endeavour to answer all questions during the Q&A session, but if we run out of time, we'll try and follow up with a response after the event. Before we hear from speakers, I just want to quickly draw attention to a recent EU Copernicus announcement that global temperatures have been at 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer over the last 12 months. This doesn't yet mean that we've exceeded 1.5 degree global warming, but it does mean that we are dangerously close. The Arctic is now recognized to be warming 4 times faster than the world as a whole. It is also acidifying faster than the global ocean, and scientists now believe that Arctic tipping points are likely to be reached. You may wonder what relevance this has to the work of the IMO. Well, next week, IMO will hold the 11th session of its Pollution Prevention and Response Sub-Committee in London. And on the agenda will be a number of climate and marine environmental pollution issues, which are of relevance to the Arctic. In particular, discussion of measures to reduce emissions of black carbon from ships burning fossil fuels, which contribute to Arctic heating. Emissions have doubled in recent years. There will also be discussions on the use of scrubbers and the discharge of scrubber wastes with a very low pH and high PAH, polyaromatic hydrocarbon, and heavy metal content. And during the webinar, we're also going to hear from speakers on the development of guidance for ships continuing to use heavy fuel oils in Arctic waters, on action to improve the control of sewage discharges, and on action to address marine plastic litter. I'm going to start by introducing all of our speakers now, rather than trying to speak in between each speaker. Our first speaker will be Bill Hemmings, Technical Advisor to the Clean Arctic Alliance, who will speak on emissions of black carbon from ships impacting the Arctic. Bill will be followed by Ilko Leemans, Technical Advisor to CAA, who will address the use of scrubbers and discharge of scrubber wastes. After which we will hear from Andrew Dumbrell, CAA's Arctic Council Strategy Advisor, and he will address the work to prepare guidelines for ships still using heavy fuel oil in the Arctic. He will be followed by Sarah Bobby, Senior Arctic Programme Manager with Ocean Conservancy, who will talk about the work to improve the requirements around sewage treatment plants. And then our final speaker today will be Amy Youngman, Legal and Policy Specialist with the Environmental Investigation Agency, who will address the work on marine plastic litter and particularly on plastic pellets. Then after that, we will have the Q&A session. I'm going to ask each speaker to give the nod to the next speaker when you finish, please. And I will interrupt if anyone starts to take much longer than their 5 minutes. Thank you. So without further ado, we'll go to the first speaker to hear more about what we can expect and hope for from PPR 11 next week. Over to you, Bill.
Thanks, Sian. Hi, everybody. I'm Black Carbon Bill. Black carbon is caused by the incomplete combustion of fossil fuel in all engines. And we all agree that for all ships, the amount emitted will depend on engine factors, certainly for ships. Size, type of ship, manufacturer, age, engine load, engine conditions, maintenance of the engine, and also on things like the weather. But everyone's also known for decades that burning a cleaner fuel cuts black carbon across the board. So for road, off-road vehicles, rail locomotives, inland shipping fuel, stringent limits on sulfur and aromatics were mandated in Europe and North America well over a decade ago. For air quality, human health and environment reasons, And they also happen with filters to enable filters which virtually eliminate BC. It's instructive to look at what happened on aviation. ICAO spent 15 years to develop jet engine standards for black carbon, what they call non-volatile particulate matter. This is for airport health and air quality reasons. The standards took effect last year. But all engines flying or in production were given a pass by ICAO because of the huge past investments in engine combustors on aircraft. However, now with climate science, it's clear that jet aircraft black carbon emitted at altitude can cause persistent contrails, which at night account for, can you believe it, about 60% of aviation's overall climate impact. So now aviation needs to spend even more billions on better engines, and that will take years, which is why the European Union has decided from next year to monitor jet fuel, sulfur and aromatics content to see how to limit and potentially reduce them. For shipping, black carbon and climate, it's in fact the Arctic. An IMO study in 2013 already recommended ships only burn cleaner fuels there, starting with distillates, which are readily available. Like aviation, Arctic marine engine standards could take many years. As you'll recall, IMO Resolution 34277 back in 2021 agreed that all ships should voluntarily switch to distillates in the Arctic. But is voluntary enough, particularly as cleaner fuels do cost more? Distillates are already widely used in sectors and indeed by many Arctic fishing vessels, while overall Arctic shipping is much less than 1% of global shipping. You can change slides now, Sylvette. Distillates will cut ship BC by varying amounts according to the engine characteristics I mentioned earlier. But the average reduction will be well over 40%, and it'll be immediate, overnight. The switch to distillates should apply to all Arctic shipping. That is, all Arctic waters north of, say, 59 degrees north. IMO Polar Code waters, for example, cover less than 25% of Arctic shipping. After that, two further steps are identified. An Arctic polar fuel standard to incentivize black carbon reductions beyond distillates, or a variant of the MARPOL sulfur ECHA regulation to include a polar fuel standard. Coastal states would introduce Arctic BC ECHAs via MARPOL amendments. Following the 2020 sulfur cap, the ISO offered to develop an indicator of the paraffinic nature of compliant low sulfur fuels compared to heavy fuel oil. However, they did not look at distillates, but they really should do that now. ISO has proposed to IMO to include what they call the viscosity gravity constant in the revised marine fuel standard ISO 8217 due out shortly as an indicator of paraffinic content. Not as a requirement, but as a tool that anyone could use to check out paraffinic levels. NGOs, however, support the alternative set out by Canada, Germany, and Iceland to PPR, to use what's called a hydrogen-carbon ratio test, because the hydrogen content of a fuel is a far superior measure of its sooting propensity. This has already been borne out by work over many years at ICAO, and indeed Concarware released a study on aviation fuel quality just last month, which says, and I'll quote, "The hydrogen content of the fuel is the primary factor that affects the impact of a fuel on NVPM number and mass emissions." That's black carbon. Quote, "The aromatic content is only weakly correlated to the hydrogen content of the fuels." So that's industry, Concarware. But in fact, developing an indicator of sooting propensity is not sufficient. We would need fuels that could meet any polar fuel standard, and then the compliance recorded in the bunker delivery note. This will all require marine fuels to be tested for hydrogen-carbon ratio. IMO and the MEPC would then use results and set a minimum hydrogen content via the HC ratio results. Distillates, in fact, already produce much less soot because they are more processed in refineries. So the switch to distillates, ladies and gentlemen, should come first. I'll now hand over to Ilko, Mr. Scrubbers. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Bill. Thanks for the bridge to the distillate fuel. And welcome all of you. I'm going to speak about scrubbers. If you don't know what that is, the other name is exhaust gas cleaning systems. And they were developed as an alternative to low sulfur fuel. You may know that that high sulfur fuel leads to all kinds of polluting problems. And so that's why IMO decided that we need low sulfur fuel. But again, exhaust gas cleaning systems were developed as an alternative. So what happened now is that more than 5,000 scrubbers worldwide discharge large amounts of seawater, of wastewater. And in this wastewater, there's toxic substances such as PAHs and heavy metals. And this is discharges everywhere, almost everywhere, I must say. And the wastewater also leads to increased acidity of the ocean water, which is already becoming more acidic due to climate change. So now, what's interesting is that in the Marpol Convention, that requires that maritime nations do not allow damage to the environment, human health, property, or resources, or those of other states. But again, scrubbers turn an air pollution problem into a water pollution problem, which is also unacceptable under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So international regulations, you would say, would not allow the use of scrubbers or the discharge of scrubber wastewater. So there's a growing number of countries that have installed restrictions for scrubber wastewater discharges. As a matter of fact, most of the European countries have such restrictions. For instance, no discharge in coastal waters. But really, what we really see is the solution is so simple. We just need a switch from HFO, heavy fuel oil, to cleaner fuel. If ships switch to cleaner fuel, there's no need for scrubbers anymore. So that is by far the most easy decision to be taken. Well, now you may wonder, what are the implications for ship owners? Well, the answer is also easy for this, as is shown by a recent Swedish paper that will be presented next week at PPR 11. Payback time for ship owners for installing scrubbers is only 1 to 5 years. But on the other hand, the cumulative societal damage is not accounted for. So what we say is we should really have a ban for scrubbers and start as soon as possible in the Arctic, which is one of the most sensitive sea areas. And well, this is perfectly in line what Bill has just been telling. So switch to distillate, stop using scrubbers, and then we will finally maybe go in the direction of really clean shipping. So that's the end of my story. And now I will hand over to Andrew Dumbrill. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Ilko, and thanks, Sean, for hosting, and Bill on description of black carbon. I'm going to be talking about the heavy fuel oil issue, and not necessarily the ban, which is coming into force on July 1st of this year, but agenda item 10, which is the development of measures to reduce risks of use and carriage of heavy fuel oil as fuel by ships in Arctic waters. The Secretariat has summarized the history of this issue in PPR 11/10, and it's a good, history lesson. Basically, these guidelines were developed to inform the issuing of waivers, which is what some call a loophole in the HFO ban. If a waiver is issued for a ship to exempt from following the HFO ban, then these waivers are to be used to guide the operations of the use of heavy fuel oil. They've always been a bit of a head scratcher for the Clean Arctic Alliance. And the Clean Arctic Alliance hasn't put any papers or made comments on these guidelines, mainly because they're really an enabling mechanism to not fully implement the HFO ban. And the Clean Arctic Alliance has been calling for a comprehensive ban to be implemented without any loopholes, waivers, or exemptions, July of this year. You know, putting that aside and looking at the actual guidelines that will be discussed, they're broken up into two sections, one for ship operators and one for maritime administrations. And they look at voyage planning, ice navigators, routing, aids to navigation, ice breaking escorts, HFO bunkering. They're very detailed and quite a long list, and they're generally helpful. However, SOLAS and the Polar Code cover most of them, most of what's in the guidelines. Again, this is getting back to the bit of a head scratcher on exactly why these guidelines are being developed in the first place. But they are a good educational tool, I suppose, and can help with routing and voyage planning in the Arctic. So they're not completely useless in that sense. A couple of comments. One is that they don't include any reference to Indigenous knowledge or the engagement of Indigenous communities. ICC hasn't been very active in developing the guidelines. There's some reference to breeding season for certain sea mammals. That's really the only reference to marine mammal, avoiding marine mammals or any of the issues around marine mammals. That could certainly be much more emphasized in the guidelines. So the discussion will be focused next week on passing the guidelines and agreeing to these guidelines. But the Clean Arctic Alliance really wants to make the point that these guidelines can't be used as an excuse for the full implementation of the HFO ban this year, July 1st, 2024. And on that, two countries of interest, Canada and Russia, it's our understanding that full implementation of the ban is uncertain, and we can't see any evidence, specifically in Canada, I can speak to Canada, of the implementation of the ban. And so we've been waiting for that guidance, that regulation in Canada. And if there are any Canadians from Transport Canada on the webinar today, I'd really welcome them to speak up on what exactly that implementation plan looks like and whether waivers are being granted or not being granted. There's still a lack of clarity on that. So I guess the last thing is these guidelines don't speak to black carbon emissions and the reduction of black carbon emissions. And so a full banning of HFO and a switch to cleaner fuels like distillate will begin to address black carbon emissions. And that is, that's all I'd like to speak to today. And over to Sarah to talk about sewage. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And yes, now for everyone's favorite topic, sewage. I'm just going to pull up a couple of slides here. One moment. All right, here we go. Hi, everyone. My name's Sarah Bobby, and as Sean mentioned, I'm the Arctic Program Manager at Ocean Conservancy. So Annex 4, sewage. what is it? Annex 4 covers the discharge of sewage for ships over 400 gross tons with 15 or more people that travel in international waters. What is the body of work at the IMO and why is this happening? So currently, the only requirement of this annex is for ships to obtain a type-approved sewage treatment plant, which is tested and approved in a lab, and then nothing else. So currently, there are no performance or testing requirements, no maintenance requirements. Now, several years ago, after concern of water quality in ports was too much to ignore, a study launched in the Netherlands demonstrated that 97% of ships were not meeting the standard. So 97% non-compliance. Now, Norway soon thereafter spearheaded work at the IMO, which is the revision of Annex 4 and associated guidelines to improve sewage regulation. And we've been working on this issue for more than 4 years, mostly via correspondence groups and online meetings. So just to reiterate, our main concern here is that sewage treatment plants are not working. This is likely due to problems with the type approval and the lack of performance standards. These sewage treatment plants may be designed to pass testing in a lab, but they're not really doing anything for long-term performance. Now, why is this a problem? I think most folks kind of understand why sewage, dumping raw sewage in the ocean is not a good thing. But, you know, so many impacts, for example, excessive algal growth from nutrients leads to dead zones having catastrophic impacts on entire ecosystems. It's a pathogen vector, it has huge implications for both environmental and human health, and much more. So what is the progress that we have made over the last 4 years? I should note again that everything is a work in progress and nothing has been approved. But as of now, here are some of the likely progress that has been made. So first is the commissioning test. This is a major change. Instead of the testing of the sewage treatment plant in a lab, it would require the testing to be on board the ship. So this will help to check if systems work in the field, if they're installed correctly and operating correctly. This will only apply to new ships. Performance tests. This will require ship operators to maintain and check equipment, and that's a great thing. However, the current draft is limited to new ships, and there is a long time between these possible performance tests. And we'd prefer to have more frequent tests and for this to cover existing ships, but I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. There's also indicative monitoring, and this will require onboard monitoring of sewage treatment plants by use of an indicative parameter. This will most likely be turbidity. There's also sewage management plans and sewage record books, and a few other provisions, but these are some of the big ones. Well, what are our goals? What do we hope to see moving forward? First and foremost, at PPR, we're really excited to have a working group, and we just hope to make a lot of progress made because there's still a lot of work to do. Oops, I don't know why that jumped. Sorry about that. But first and foremost, we need to do something about the poor performance on existing ships. We need performance monitoring and effluent limits. We have less member state support on this, on improving existing ship performance than we would like, which is a bit baffling considering that the current ships are showing once again a 97% non-compliance, and they're basically discharging raw sewage everywhere. This PPR, we have a paper in from our ENGO coalition stressing the importance of existing ship performance monitoring and effluent limits. I will note it appears that the group is supportive of discharge records and management plans for existing ships, and this will be a big focus of the work we're doing in the working group at PPR. Second, we need regular monitoring of all ships. We support at least annual monitoring, but as of now in the drafting, it can be up to 5 years between monitoring requirements and is only on new ships. And we're concerned that once a commissioning test is complete and sewage treatment plant performance will not be reviewed until nearly 5 years later. And we've seen in sampling in Alaska that there's large variability that indicates that high frequency of sampling is really needed to ensure these plants are working. And finally, we would love to see no discharge of sludge and untreated sewage in all waters, not just 12 nautical miles offshore, but in the very least in sensitive places like the Arctic. And that will be it for me. I just want to let folks know if you're at PPR, we're having a wastewater side event on February 21st at 12:45. And I will hand this over to Amy. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Let's see if this is working. Oop. Can folks see my screen now? Sorry.
Yes.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Amy Youngman. I'm a lawyer and legal policy specialist from EIA, who are members of the Clean Shipping Coalition. And we are all becoming more aware of the damaging effects of plastic pollution, and scientists even warn us that without intervention by 2050, there will be more plastic in the ocean than fish. And so to address this, the IMO has created an action plan to address marine plastic litter from ships and aims to have zero plastic discharge by 2025. And part of this workstream has identified two primary sources of marine plastic pollution: plastic pellets and plastic fishing gear. So what is a plastic pellet? Well, you can see here on the slide that a pellet is a very small, often bead-like particle of plastic, and it's sometimes found in larger flakes. These plastics are raw materials produced in bulk that are the feedstock that create almost all plastic products. And 99% of plastic is derived from fossil fuel. So after fossil fuels go through polymerization, these pellets are packaged and transported around the globe. The supply chain often involves freight containers shipped by sea, and all too often are lost at sea, creating environmental disasters. So those of you following the news may have heard about a cargo ship which lost just one container of these pellets in December and subsequently destroyed Galician coastlines. These two pictures are from our partners in Spain and show how many pellets are in just a few bags, noting that thousands of bags were lost and about 60 washed up on shore. Also looking at the sand, you can see how difficult it is to clean up, and you can see how it affects marine life. However, loss is preventable. It just requires industry changes. So the working group addressing marine plastic litter is currently addressing pellets through two steps. First, creating a circular that has recommendations for packaging, notification, stowage, and disaster response protocol, all to mitigate loss and contain and clean up loss if accidents do occur. The second is amending a mandatory legal instrument to make voluntary guidance mandatory. However, that does disrupt the status quo of shipping, and we're receiving a lot of pushback from industry related to stowage requirements. So at PPR 11, we would like to see the working group first finalize the circular to be adopted at MEPC 81. However, industry is proposing a little bit of a wacky pellet definition. So we'd like to see a clear and harmonized definition that aligns with the OSPAR and ISO definition of plastic pellet. And then secondly, to choose an instrument to make amendments to get those mandatory measures. Despite, we are seeing some submissions from industry in China stating that they would like to delay this process. So in addition to pellets, we are also looking at strengthening MARPOL Annex 5 on fishing gear. Abandoned, lost, or otherwise discarded fishing gear has devastating effects on the environment and maritime safety. And so to strengthen regulations, EIA finds it essential to have real-time reporting made available to authorities without jeopardizing commercially sensitive information and staying low burden, accessible, and relevant. In addition to real-time reporting, we're calling for coastal states to have access to IMO database for effective interventions and for relevant experts and agencies to be able to periodically access this anonymized data to analyze trends and make recommendations on mitigative measures. And to be most effective, this should be paired with mandatory gear marking following the FAO's current guidance. Unfortunately, the correspondence group has paused work on marking and only advanced intersessional work on reporting. So we also support advancing those mandatory measures on gear marking and starting ship plans for storage of fishing gear. And then finally, if IMO does not want to actually advance this work, the Global Plastic Treaty does. So the IMO should and could play a complementary role if they do not delay these mandatory measures. But we're asking the subcommittee to request the IMO Secretariat to submit an INFDOC to the fourth session of the treaty negotiations to report on the competencies, progress of action, and the timelines related to enhancing or introducing legally binding measures within the regulatory framework on fishing gear and plastic pellets. Such a report should also update on the progress of the action plan as a whole, because we are currently not on track to reach our zero discharge by 2025. And so we really need an update about what the IMO competencies are. And that's it for me, but I look forward to any questions. And if you have, or if you want to check out more on plastic, we have submitted 3 documents, so PPR 11, 13, 4, 12, and 14. Thank you very much, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you, everyone. We're going to move straight into the Q&A, and I can see there are questions coming in. So I'm going to ask, first of all of the speakers to turn on your cameras so that we can see you. And thank you. We have a slide up just to remind everybody of the names of the speakers and who they represent. So thank you for that. As I said, please, if you've got questions, put them into the Q&A option, which I think generally is at the bottom of your screens. Hopefully it's the same for everyone, and we will try and work our way through them. I'm going to start off. The first question came in for Ilko from Shay Burnett, and is asking about the positions on a couple of the papers that are being submitted to PPR next week. Ilko, are you happy to go ahead and respond to Shay's question?
Yes, good questions. Yeah, good question. So basically, the simple answer is anything that will reduce the impact of scrubber discharges is good. So what, for instance, in a New Zealand paper, New Zealand also says that they do not consider it appropriate to wait until unacceptable levels of risks or impacts are reached before adopting regulatory measures for scrubbers. Damage to marine ecosystem and marine economies can be reversible at that point. So New Zealand is also calling for faster regulation. It could be national or international, also calling on IMO. And the EU paper that you're referring to is also, let's say, lobbying or asking for a regulation scheme or where coastal states can install restrictions in their exclusive economic zone, so that the 200-mile zone. And yeah, so basically what we are asking the IMO for, that they should develop regional bans in ecologically, environmentally, and culturally significant areas, including the Arctic. But in the end, what we believe is a global ban on scrubbers is by far the best. And that is in line with, you know, what shipping has to really do in the coming decades, you know, to become a really sustainable, clean business. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Ilko. The next question that's come up is from Anna Belinsky, who's asking about whether or not it would be possible to ban shipping in the Arctic. Before I hand this over to a panelist, I'm just going to say, depending on what you consider to be the Arctic, there are over 11,000 vessels already operating on an annual basis in the waters north of 60 degrees north. So a ban would be huge when you're talking about those number of vessels. And even if you just look at what the Polar Code defines as Arctic waters, which is not the whole Arctic by any means, you're still talking around at nearly 2,000 vessels. Having said that, there are a number of groups, including some of the members of the Clean Arctic Alliance, that are actively looking for a moratorium on shipping activity in the Central Arctic Ocean, but that's not the whole Arctic. But Andrew, I think you'd probably like to come in on this as well, so I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks for the question, Anna. Shipping is critical infrastructure for Arctic communities and indigenous peoples. And you can't overstate that. You know, it's an essential service. Essential goods and services are brought in by resupply. So the Clean Arctic Alliance, as long as I'm around anyway, won't ever call for banning shipping in the Arctic primarily for that reason. You know, the job of regulators and researchers and shipping operators is to reduce the impact as much as possible. And there are a plethora of measures, you know, many of that have been mentioned today, that could drastically reduce the footprint of shipping in Arctic waters. And, you know, just implementing the HFO ban on July 1st of this year could drastically reduce the risks from spills and emissions of black carbon. You know, both habitat and climate from switching to a cleaner distillate fuel that's readily available right now. You know, it doesn't take huge investments in infrastructure. So just to be clear on this, you know, communities depend on shipping for essential goods and services. So we're not talking about a ban. We're talking about cleaner, low impact, responsible shipping. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Sarah, there's a couple of questions around sewage. Are you able to pick up on both of those? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Let me look. Okay, so question. Oh, sorry, my kind of scrolled up a little bit here. Okay. What types of ships and what marine lines or cruise lines have the highest non-compliance? Well, so in this study in the Netherlands, as far as I recall, it was a variety of ships, and that was 97% non-compliance. So basically, all ships. Now, the problem is that third-party verified data is really hard to find. One place that you can find that is in the state of Alaska, because that's one of the few places in the world that does require monitoring. It does have enforcement of effluent standards, and basically what was found there, it was first and foremost, the regulations were created because one testing and monitoring was done. It was found that basically none of the cruise ships, sorry, these regulations are specific to cruise ships, were meeting standard. And then over the 20 years of doing this monitoring and compliance, it just reinforced the fact that unless you are doing monitoring, unless you are record keeping, unless you are enforcing these standards, it's really easy for these sewage treatment systems to stop working and not be in compliance. So basically, that's why we need for all ships, why we need that constant monitoring. And let's see. And question from Shay, what will BCA's response from Japan proposals within PPR 11.12.3 to expand the allowable range of TRA and pH sewage treatment plants will be mandated to address the uncertainties of ship operations? Yeah, so I know we do not support this. I would love to talk with you, Shay, a little bit more specifically about the technical details of why we don't support this, but there's also a proposal from Japan that reinforces their belief that we should not do anything on existing ships at this time and should just focus on new ships. And as I've stated in my 5 minutes in just now, we strongly support addressing the poor performance standards for both new and for new ships, but then also for existing ships. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Bill, I'm going to come back to you then. And also just to encourage anyone to ask any more questions in the Q&A. But Bill, what do you think? And actually, Amy, I'm going to ask you the same question. So a heads up, you can have a little bit of time to think about it. What can we actually achieve next week? How much progress can be made? So first, Bill on black carbon and then Amy on plastics. Thank you.
Okay. There are some really important things we can achieve. And let's face it, on black carbon, we've already been at it for 13 years. Do we want another 13 years? This is a climate crisis, and the climate crisis is really critical in the Arctic. And so the first thing to do is for PPR to shoot off the proposal for a mandatory switch to distillates to MEPC in a couple of months' time, and get the switch to distillates transformed from a voluntary measure. We've already got that basic resolution, and make it a mandatory measure. So that's the first thing that PPR can easily do. And if you're talking to delegations, I appeal to you. It's the future of mankind, not of the planet. It's the future of mankind on the planet that these simple things are done. I think two other things. The ISO only looked at comparing low sulfur fuels with heavy fuel oil. They've got easy access to the test data because so many people test fuels before bunkering. They can easily have a look at the calculations for distillate fuel, and so that could be done over the next 6 months. They've finished the revision of the basic fuel standard 8217, so that could be done. And I think the third thing is let's get agreement on a direct measurement of sooting propensity, which is the hydrogen-carbon ratio. There are tests out there. So rather than a complicated calculation, which is the viscosity gravity constant, let's go with a simple measure of hydrogen content, which is a hydrogen-carbon ratio, and then we can get working after the distillate switch on characterizing future fuels for reducing sooting propensity even further. 1, 2, and 3. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. And Amy, you're welcome to address that question, but there is now a question in the Q&A for you as well. So perhaps you could do both. Thank you.
Sure. I'll speak to one thing that we can achieve on pellets, and then I'll address this on fishing gear. On pellets, I think it's really critical that we finalize the draft MEP circular that can then go to MEPC and be voluntary guidance on the transportation of plastic pellets by sea. That's going to be really critical that we use an inclusive definition that captures all plastic feedstock, which could be larger than the 10 millimeters that are being proposed with size limits at the moment. So I think that the first thing we can achieve is just finalizing that and moving forward at that. And then related to the fishing gear question, as far as net fragments, that is one area that can kind of become more complicated for gear marking, but we do see some measures that include using certain thread that can be identified, so that might kind of get at that fragmented piece, but also gear marking on all types of fishing gear. So not just nets, but we'd want to see different FADs and pots also have gear marking on them. So I think that the FAO voluntary guidance is great, and what we need to do now is make that mandatory, and we need to do that by amending MARPOL Annex 5. So yes, it does address partially fragments, although that will always be an issue. That's why we also think it's necessary to pair that with real-time reporting, so that we understand when certain thresholds are lost, and we can go and help retrieve those.
Thanks, Amy. We're getting close to the end of the webinar, but there are 2 more questions. I'm going to make them the last 2 unless any urgent ones come in, but one for Bill on PPR 1161, and then Sarah, we'll go straight on to you if we can on the question from Larry Edwards. Thank you.
Yeah, on getting work on a polar fuel standard, the key, I think, is a test for sooting propensity. And so if it's good enough for ICAO to already have in the engine certification standards a hydrogen-carbon ratio test, I think it's not beyond the wit of man to have a hydrogen-carbon ratio test for marine fuels. And that can then lead to, as I say, the testing of all marine fuels at the moment, so we can characterize them for hydrogen content through the HC ratio. And then, it's got to go back to regulators. It's not standards bodies which set standards, they codify the standards, but we need to get that test data in front of IMO members and then agree on what would be the minimum hydrogen content, and then bingo, you have an Arctic polar standard, and which could also then be used for BC ECAs.
Sarah, go ahead on that last question.
Sure. The last question is Ocean Conservancy working in the Alaska legislature on the issues of ocean rangers, et cetera. We don't work on this directly. I will say we are very dismayed on what happened with the Ocean Ranger program. For people who aren't familiar, the monitoring and enforcement that I talked about in Alaska had basically been happening for 20 years, and a lot of that program was dismantled a few years ago. I will say that we continue to do what we can to enforce the fact, or to reiterate the fact that monitoring enforcement are completely necessary, and the state of Alaska, through their 20 years of having ocean rangers and doing this program, have shown its importance. And actually, related to that, Ed White, the former head of the Alaska Cruise Program, is going to attend PPR so he can share his years of knowledge working for the state and learning all about this system. with folks at PPR and just really enforce the need for everything I discussed today. So we're happy to have him. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. We're actually out of time, so I'm sure there's a lot more. There's certainly a few more questions I would like to ask of the panelists, but we'll have to follow up with those later. I'd just like to thank everybody who's spoken today, Bill, Ilko, Andrew, Sarah, and Amy. I really appreciate you giving up the time to speak on this webinar organised by the Clean Arctic Alliance. I think it's really helpful, and I hope the questions and the discussions have been useful as well. Up on the screen, we're going to just put up some very brief take-home messages on each of the issues that have been addressed today on black carbon, scrubbers, heavy fuel oil, sewage and marine plastics. I'd also like to thank all of the participants today. We couldn't hold these webinars without you, so thank you for joining us today. Thank you for providing questions and contributing to the discussion. As I said at the beginning, it's our intention to make the recording of the webinar available on our website, and details on that will be circulated to participants probably tomorrow. And in the meantime, I hope that everyone has found today's discussion useful, and I hope that PPR 11 next week is going to be a successful meeting and will make significant progress on all of these important issues.
Sean,
So
maybe mention the side events next week, no?
Thanks, Bill. Yes, I think one of them's been mentioned anyway, but during PPR next week, for those that will be there, I'm afraid it is only accessible to those who are actually participants at PPR, but there are 2 side events that we are involved with. There might be others as well, but there's one on Tuesday lunchtime focusing on fuel quality and the black carbon issue. And then there is one, as I think was briefly mentioned earlier, on Wednesday lunchtime addressing the wastewater issues. So please do come along to those if you're at PPR in London next week. Otherwise, I'd just like to say thank you again to all of our speakers and to the participants. So thank you very much.